How will we power our future? Can we create a healthy and clean economy? Climate One at the Commonwealth Club is at the forefront of the global debate about energy, economy, and the environment. Bringing together the brightest and most provocative leaders of our time, Climate One is the place where big ideas get heard. With thoughtful and insightful discussions on policy, business, science, and culture, Climate One founder Greg Dalton gets to the heart of the matter. It's our future. It's time to come together.
Today on Climate One, Mark Kurlansky and Anna Lepay, two prolific and influential authors, join us to talk about feeding a hot and crowded world. How can we continue to feed the planet without destroying it in the process? It's a conversation about the costs of global food production. Climate One starts now. Agriculture is responsible for about 14% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Cows that produce milk and are carved into steaks are the biggest offenders in the ag sector. That's one reason why environmentalists love to hate cattle, which emit climate-eating methane from both ends of their bodies. But people love their milk and burgers. And a recent New York Times Magazine article made a compelling case that cows can help fight climate change by being part of an ecosystem that stores carbon and water in the soil. Anna Lepay, in 2006, you read a famous report called Livestock's Long Shadow. How did that set you on the course that you've been writing about? Well, you come from a food family, but how did that...
I do.
Yeah.
So it's not the most dramatic story to tell about how you get sparked about an idea. I was sitting in my Brooklyn brownstone apartment reading a study from the United Nations, but it was really striking to me. It was a report that for the first time experts really tried to piece together the full climate story of livestock and really tried to determine, if we look at the whole picture, not just the food they're eating and not just the methane they're emitting and not just the transport, but all of it together, what do we get? And what they found is that livestock as a whole sector emitted at the time, it was about 18% of all global greenhouse gas emissions, which was more than every single train, plane, and automobile at the time. And I remember thinking, why isn't everybody talking about this? And then, of course, you start peeling the layers even more. We don't just eat meat and dairy. We consume a lot of other things. And you look at the whole story of food sector-related emissions. And today, that figure is about 30%. So you heard in your intro, you said 14% is agriculture. Well, that's direct agricultural emissions. But put it all together, all of the aspects of food production, from seed to plate to landfill, and you're talking about a third of the crisis. So I got really inspired to dig in, and I ended up writing a book about it, and to this day continue to explore these questions of how food connects to climate.
Mark Kurlansky, you write that milk is the most argued over food in human history and also the most regulated. So how is it the most argued over? That surprised me.
Well, yeah, it's always been argued over for like 10,000 years. And it's not surprising if you think about it. I mean, what is milk? It's this bodily fluid that we're supposed to feed to our babies, and then nobody knows when this moment was. I would have loved to have been there when, either the mother couldn't produce enough milk or the mother had died, and somebody said, "Oh, look at that goat over there. Maybe we can use that." I mean, so always tremendous arguments about mother's milk versus animal milk and many other things. The thing about milk arguments is that they don't go away because they don't get resolved. We just get more and more of them. We keep adding to them. So there's newer milk arguments and there's really old arguments. I guess the oldest one is whether you should use animals, and then after that, which animals you should use, but which hasn't been resolved.
We wanted to talk to an actual dairy farmer as we're talking about milk and cows and methane. So we talked with the CEO of the St. Benoit Creamery, where he's talking about some of his company's business decisions.
I'm Eric Bartom. I'm the CEO of St. Benoit Creamery. We are a small creamery in Sonoma, California. Our milk is very little processed. It's low pasteurized and it cannot travel much. We are completely non-GMO and organic. So we know the animals are well treated. This is very important to us. The second thing is that we get milk from Jersey cows, and Jersey cows like to go on pasture. So they're not cows that like to sit on a farm like Holsteins could be. They are on pasture all year long. Of course, one of the sacrifices is that when you go with this kind of breed, the productivity or the amount of milk that's produced by a cow in a day is certainly less than it can be with a lazy Holstein. The cost or the price that we pay the farmer for the milk is much more, way more, almost 3 times the price of a regular Holstein cow. So our products are not cheap. Our products are, I would say, expensive on the markets, but it's also for a clientele that is caring about the environment, caring about the animals, and caring about having good food for themselves or for their families.
That's the CEO of the St. Benoit Creamery, Eric Batum. So Anna Lepay, there's a lot in there. Poke at Holstein cows. We'll get Mark Kurlansky on that. But the idea that wholesomeness and economic value, environmental concern costs more, is that elitist? Is that true?
Well, is it true and is it elitist or different questions, I think. I would say that, if you want to talk about elitism, I would think the entire way our current food system is structured is inherently elitist, where the worst paid folks in our economy are in the food sector, where you have an entire concentration of wealth, where some of the best paid CEOs are in the food sector, and at the same time you have farm workers barely able to feed themselves. That to me is the elitist dynamic of our food system. To this question of, though, to the cost question, does it cost more to, say, support, I don't know how many of you have had that product. I have. It's quite delicious, and it is quite expensive. It can certainly cost more to, say, the individual consumer in the marketplace. And part of that is because we are paying the true cost of our food. When you're paying more, when you're actually giving more of your dollar to the farmer. But what is exciting to me when we start looking at these sustainability solutions is that actually I like to tell the story that ultimately they're going to cost us a whole lot less, because the kinds of practices that sustainable farmers are using on their land don't incur the costs that you and I all incur in our taxpayer dollars when we have to spend money to pay for the pollution that's caused by agriculture, or pay for all the other externalities, as economists like to call it, about our current industrial system. So to me, the real story is this way of farming that's going to be more in concert with nature is ultimately going to save us a lot of money, particularly when it comes to how we can harness sustainable food to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and help fix the climate.
Anna Lepay, there's some companies that are doing what's called clean meat, which is either beef burger without the cow, tuna fish sandwich without the tuna. Is that perhaps a solution that doesn't have the environmental impacts to create meat in a laboratory?
I would say there's really 2 different categories that are getting lumped together by the industry gave themselves this nice sounding term, clean meat. You have really, I think it's important for us to understand there's really 2 different paths of essentially alternatives to what we think of animal-based proteins. One path is these plant-based proteins that are actually based on plants. So it's products that are trying to create alternatives to dairy using, say, legumes grown in France to make a product called Ripple that's an alternative to milk. On the other hand, you have these companies that are creating meat products in a lab, and they are cultured. They have starter cultures that tend to come from crops that are not so good for the environment, like sugarcane. They require a lot of energy. I remember going to a clean meat conference, and during the breakout session at lunchtime, there was an entire corner of the room piled with a pyramid of plastic Petri dishes, and then in front was a little sample of a burger, and they were saying, well, we're still trying to figure out how to scale this, but that's how many Petri dishes we need to make this burger here. There's a ton of questions I and a lot of other folks that are more expert in this than I are asking about these companies, and yet a lot of investor dollars are going in. I think for these reasons that we understand that when beef cattle uses 3/5 of the world's land but is only giving us 5% of our protein calories, we should be rethinking meat. I think doing it this way, to me, raises a lot more questions than are answered so far in what I've seen from what these companies are putting out about what they're doing.
And the thing is that we're kind of, in our attempt to help people, we're making life really difficult for people because they're just inundated with all of these choices. And, I was recently in a Whole Foods at the meat counter, and they had these New York steaks, not New York cut, but, from New York. And this woman said, "Well, do you have anything that's grass-fed?" And they said, "Yeah, these over here are grass-fed." And she said, "But that says Australia." And he says, "Yeah, they're from Australia." And she says, "Can I get something local that's grass-fed?" And the guy, in this heavy New York accent, said, "Make up your mind, lady. You want to be a locavore or you want to be a grass-fed?"
Which gets to the point of how much time people spend at the grocery store. Anna LePay, I have this image of you spending 5 hours in the grocery store because you're analyzing and looking on the internet, because it's complex. You go to, for Marine Stewardship Council, all these different labels. Yeah. Is it easier than that?
It's really, we're lucky in that we have a grocery store that's locally owned and does a lot of my sort of thinking for me and having great products on the shelves. But actually, I really push back around the it's too confusing messaging, because actually eating this sort of climate-friendly diet, if you want to call it that, you actually erase a lot of the questions that you have. When I look at our kitchen, we don't have that many brands, we don't have that much packaged food, so I don't have to, go into, does this what's the latest labor atrocity of this company? Is it okay to buy it? Because we're eating mostly whole foods, not from the Whole Foods grocery store, but whole foods, like real food that then we have to cook. What I would say, though, to this, it's complicated, and we haven't really touched on this yet together, is that, to me, then, the story needs to wrap into what are the policy changes we need to make so that we, as individual consumers, don't have to, it's not all on us, right? We don't have to be constantly bombarded with, is this label telling us the right thing? Does this have some toxic pesticide? We should have a set of policies that raises the floor so that when you go into the grocery store, you don't have to worry, does that can have a lining that might make your kid sick? Does that company produce palm oil in Indonesia that's going to worsen climate change? We should be setting policies in place so that that floor gets raised so we as individuals don't have to be doing that thinking.
Mark Kurlansky, some of the things that people are concerned about in the fish, for example, there's some myths about safety, and there's one about people have probably heard about salmon that's dyed with the same things that the Shirley Temple cherries are, or something like that. Is that true?
No, when they first started farming salmon. When you farm salmon, it doesn't have the kind of crustacean diet that it has at sea, and so the flesh doesn't turn that pink color. It's white, which they were fine with, but nobody bought it. And for a while, they tried to market it as white salmon, but nobody wanted it. So they got the stuff from the crustaceans to feed to the farmed salmon so that they would have that color. And a lot of people, they think they're giving them red dye number 2 or something. It's not. They're just sort of recreating what would happen at sea. There's a lot of issues with farmed salmon, but that really isn't one of them.
We're talking about food and climate change with Mark Kurlansky, best-selling author, and also another best-selling author, Anna LePay. I'm Greg Dalton. You've done some interesting travels, Mark, virtually, and Anna, actually, with your mother, you visited 5 continents to write the book Hope's Edge. So tell us about that journey and kind of, 5 continents in 1 minute. But, and I want to get Mark to hear his virtual tour with his daughter.
Okay, so what of all of those stories? So yes, my mother and I wrote a book together, which when I tell that to people, sometimes they're shocked you could write a book with your mother. But we looked at examples around the world where people were developing these really creative solutions to make food systems work for health and climate. And to me, I think one of the most inspiring experiences was going to one of the largest cities in Brazil, a city called Belo Horizonte, or Beautiful Horizon, and seeing what a city government could do if they started looking at food differently, not just as another commodity to be sold in the marketplace, but as a basic human right. And if food becomes a human right, then all of a sudden these elected officials in the city had a whole different frame of mind about policymaking, about, well, then it's our responsibility as the elected officials here to ensure that everybody has a right to access good, healthy food. And what we saw was within a decade, they had innovated all of these incredible policies, which in 1 minute I won't have time to go into, but they had decreased infant mortality by something like 73%. They had decreased hunger by some huge margin. They had helped all the regional farmers by connecting them to urban consumers. And they had really, I would not say solved hunger, but as one of my friends put it, who wrote a whole book about this, they had begun to end hunger. To see that on a scale of a huge city really doing this incredible work through, again, really creative policies was really inspiring. And some of those policies that we witnessed there in Bello, now I have seen spreading all around the world.
Mark Kurlansky, your book, International Night, father and daughter cooked their way around the world. I noticed you food from Kazakhstan. I'm curious what
That wasn't easy. The deal was that, and this was a game that my daughter and I played before we decided to make it into a book. After we did about 25 different countries, my editor said, well, why don't you do 52 countries and make it a book? So I'd spin the globe, she'd close her eyes, and wherever her finger landed, we would make a dinner from that place. She kept landing on Kazakhstan.
And what do you cook from Kazakhstan? Do you even remember?
Well, with Kazakhstan, see, there was always this conflict, because these were meals that my daughter and I were making for my wife, and, they were family meals. And the question was always, do we want authenticity or do we want a good meal? So, where there's mutton, I say lamb, So our Kazakhstan meal, there was some very good dumplings, actually. But it was a good meal, but not
your favorite.
Not terribly authentic.
Anna Lepay, are food miles overstated, exaggerated? There's, Michael Pollan educated a lot of people about food miles. Look where your food comes from. And yet some people think that food miles have been kind of overblown.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was one of the things I was really curious about. And actually, if you look at the science around what percentage of your greenhouse gas emissions associated with the transport of your food, what percentage of your food that is. It's actually a relatively small percentage. But what I would sort of caution folks to do, though, is not say, okay, then we can, get this food from halfway around the world and get this food from the other halfway around the world, is that local is often proxy, actually, for a whole suite of other benefits of your food. So, when a Michael Pollan is talking about supporting and buying local food, I'm pretty sure Michael is not meaning, if you live near a Twinkie factory, go buy the Twinkie, right? He really means support your region of your regional food shed. He means, go to the farmers that are promoting biodiversity, that are keeping your land protected from sprawl, that are, tending to your watershed.
You don't think the local Twinkies are better?
So I don't know. I don't live near a Twinkie factory, as far as I know. So,
no, but, you had mentioned this book I had done, Food of a Younger Land, which was food writing that was done for the WPA in the 1930s. And the food was all local. And, one of the results of that you could see was that in most places, people ate really badly in the wintertime. If you read this book, you're going to think twice about being a locavore. Mm-hmm.
Well, it's a luxury that certain people in Mediterranean climates have.
Right.
Yes.
Right. And, I think to me, what is important to realize when you bring up this food miles question and start thinking about it is it really starts drilling you down then to this question of, well, then what is the most important thing if you care about the environmental impact of your food or you want to eat a more climate-friendly diet? It's really a question of what are you eating, how was it grown, where was it grown, and because most of the percentage of greenhouse gas emissions associated with your food come from that agricultural production slice. It's about 80 to 85%. So that brings us into what we would have the most impact.
What is food? And Anna LePay, you have a TEDx talk about empathy for both for workers, and so talk about the collective empathy of food. And
yeah, so I was talking in that speech this idea of this way that food can actually elicit our innate sense of empathy. I started thinking about it as I started reflecting on the farmers and farm workers I'd met, and started realizing that when I make food choices for myself and my family, I do really think about how does this food choice not just feed my two daughters the healthiest food for them, but it really does create the sense of empathy in me where I think about, was there a farm worker mother living in Salinas Valley who had to be exposed to chlorpyrifos, a toxic insecticide, to grow the lettuce that I'm giving my kids for dinner? And realizing that for me, for instance, choosing food that isn't grown with toxic pesticides is an empathetic choice, that it's both really about my care for myself and really my kids, but really it's about caring for people all across the food chain, and how I think food can be this act of expression of that collective empathy for the farmer you're never going to meet, the farm worker you're never going to meet, the butterfly and bee you're never going to see buzz by, but was saved because you didn't purchase the food that was grown with the neonicotinoid that killed those bees and butterflies. So I think there is a way that it can tap us into, I think, a really beautiful part of human nature, which is our capacity to feel empathy.
Yeah. Can I just talk a minute about pesticides, because it's an interesting example. Before DDT was developed during World War II because American troops in the Pacific were getting a lot of malaria. And before DDT came along, basically what farmers did was what is called biological control, which is you bring in the bug that eats the bug that you want to get rid of. Mm-hmm. And it's a very difficult and complicated thing, because you're talking about, invasive species and bringing in things that weren't supposed to be there. And, in nature, there's always, biologists call it the law of unintended consequences. But research on the science just sort of went away when DDT came along, and all the research went into coming up with more and more kinds of chemicals to kill them. And it's an example of how corporations took over science and really pointed it in a wrong direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the figure is about 1%, maybe 2% of all research dollars is going to exploring these biological control methods, and the rest of it is going to this chemical model of agriculture, which we're seeing creates these pesticide treadmills.
Was it Dow? Who was it? Better Living with Chemicals?
Mm-hmm. DuPont, maybe, but yeah. They're now one company, so...
Right. We're going to go to our lightning round and ask some quick questions of our guests today. First section is association. I'll mention a noun, and you mention the first thing
this is kind of scary.
Comes. The first thing that comes to your mind, unfiltered. And
this is going to reveal our psychological problems more than anything else.
So the first thing that comes to your mind, Anna LePay, if I say chocolate.
Delicious.
Mark Kurlansky, kale.
Green was the first thing that came to my mind.
Anna LePay, quinoa.
Questions.
Mark Kurlansky, Chardonnay.
Oh. I'm just blanking out on it.
Not interested. Okay. Anna LePay, you have met foodies who care more about the temperature of their goat cheese than the homeless people outside their grocery store.
Have I met them? I'm not sure. So
you heard about them?
I've heard about them, yes.
Okay. True or false, Mark Kurlansky, 60% of people in the world are lactose intolerant.
That is correct.
Also, Mark Kurlansky, true or false, some seals should be shot to reduce their population and protect salmon.
Oh, wait. You can't do a one-word answer on this.
Okay.
Right, otherwise he's going to go down as like the seal killer.
Yeah.
No, that's not fair, yeah.
No, I mean, you're reducing an extremely complicated thing. The Marine Mammal,
journalists love to do, yes.
The Marine Mammal Protection Act in the 1970s was a good thing because, you got to start with the the idea that you have to preserve all species and preserve the natural order. So marine mammals were disappearing, so this protected them. The problem is that because they now don't have any natural enemies, they're extremely abundant.
Yeah.
And
balancing the predator, because
I don't think you should shoot them. I have been out working on commercial salmon gill netters in Alaska, where a whole net of salmon were destroyed by salmon.
By seals.
By seals.
Yeah.
And I wanted to shoot them. Fortunately, in Alaska, you're not allowed to carry a firearm in a commercial fishing boat. But I wouldn't have done it because it would have been a wrong thing to do. What I would say is I understand the frustration of fishermen. But, it's like ranchers and fishermen and all these people, they just have to accept the fact that they're living with nature. Ranchers have to accept the fact that they're supposed to be predators. Yeah, there's wolves around, and the wolves will sometimes eat your livestock, but they're supposed to be there. If you choose to raise livestock in the Northern Rockies, they're supposed to be predators there. And if you want to get into the fishing business, there's going to be cormorants and bald eagles and seals and things that'll eat some of your fish. And that's the game that you have to be engaged in.
Yeah, and they keep the systems in balance.
It's called the natural order.
Yeah, those apex predators are important to keeping it in balance. Last question in our lightning round, true or false for Anna LePay. You secretly dream of watching Three's Company and eating Cheetos.
Oh, is that you're quoting me? So I guess sometimes in this TEDx talk, I confessed that as a child, we had to keep our television locked in the closet. It would only come out occasionally, and the closest thing I got to junk food in the kitchen was, I think a rice cracker and maybe some honey on top of it. So I said, secretly sometimes I would dream of eating Cheetos and watching Three's Company.
All right, let's give them a round for getting through that gauntlet of the lightning round here at Climate One.